we want to approach the way we write rules in a way that's going to actually help the space grow. And because there's a lot of major players that will not get into this space until there's clarity on regulation, right? And not just tax, we're talking from the SEC and CFTC. And so, again, we want, at least from a tax standpoint, which is the world I live in, we want as much clarity as possible for you as taxpayers so that you know what your requirements and obligations are.
Welcome back to Block Fuel Podcast. We are here live at the Convention Center at Permissionless in Salt Lake City with Seth Wilks, the Executive Director at the IRS. So you do not want to miss this one. So Seth, before we get started, what does that mean? What does that role do? I think this is something that a lot of our fans are going to be tuning in very carefully with. But what does your role actually entail?
Yeah, so about 2.5 years ago, the IRS realized that they needed to stand up an office who was going to focus on digital assets. And they, basically set up this office to bring in folks who had been working on digital assets. So we've been working on digital assets for a long time. And so these are folks who have been working on like the Coinbase John Doe summons and criminal investigators and doing a lot of different things in digital assets, but they weren't on one team. And so the goal was to create this office to be able to kind of create a center of excellence of all of the knowledge around digital assets, to help create training, to evaluate technologies and all of that kind of thing. And so about a year ago, the IRS decided that they really wanted to invest further in this office by bringing in outside talent. So people who have been in the industry, who have worked in this space for a long time. And so I was fortunate to come to he gave me a 4-year appointment to spend some time there and see what my experience in the digital asset industry could do to help enhance the rulemaking process and their internal policies. And fortunately, I get to do it with my co-pilot, Raj Mukherjee, who also came on from the outside. He's an attorney. I'm a CPA. We kind of bring two different backgrounds to the office, but really the goal at the end of the day is to be that center of excellence where we can be that knowledge source, whether it's making rules or evaluating guidance. And so, it's been a really cool ride so far, 7 months. Yeah.
And so before I pass it over to Jody here, I saw you worked at like TaxBit. Prior to that, you were kind of always within that side of the house. Now, what are the major like differences, I guess, coming from the private side working now for the public?
So I think you worked at a startup before, and you know what it's like. The mantra usually is like move fast and break things, right? Yeah. And then coming into the government where it's like move slow and move slower. And so I say that out of humor, but the truth is like our office is small and nimble. And so there really is an opportunity for us to move quickly and institute new policies. But the experience of working in a startup where okay, we're hiring you for this. I was originally hired to be a subject matter expert, but then it very quickly became, hey, we need somebody to focus on product development. Okay, we've got clients now. We need to do implementations. And now it's so at TaxBit, I was able to work in so many different ways, like working again with our product teams, our engineers, our implementations. And at the same time, I built a policy team where we were working with folks on Capitol Hill, working with Treasury and the IRS. And so every part of that taught me something new about crypto and about blockchain. And so I think that coming into the IRS with that experience, I think I've seen this industry from several different perspectives, which I think has served us well when it comes to the rulemaking process.
Yeah. So Seth, I mean, coming in, we really appreciate you taking time. This is an interview we were excited about because it gives us an opportunity to educate a lot of our audience in a lot of places that people have a lot of false assumptions or they read interpretations from somebody else on Twitter, and it's not the best source of information. So to kick things off from my side, would love to know, so the 2024 Digital Asset is a guidelines came out recently, and basically what are the external communication channels that you have? Where can our followers go and say, hey, this is what the IRS is saying directly, and these are the words you need to read? Don't take a summary of that.
Yeah, so first off, I say this almost everywhere I go. Don't take tax advice from social media.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, look, what I do love about this industry is it is very active on the socials. And like, I think that's really cool because there's a ton of engagement. But we recognize that we need to be able to meet the taxpayer where they are. And so I think we have a long way to go. But one of the things that we've developed is if you go to irs.gov/digital assets, you'll actually find a landing page that really shows like all of the FAQs that we've created, all of the guidance that we've put out so far. But there's a lot of work to be done. Like a lot of it is more designed for CPAs and attorneys, people who are technical in nature. I think that we have a lot of opportunity to do better at meeting the taxpayer where they're at. And honestly, this is like why we're doing this today is because I know you guys have a lot of followers who, are investing in cryptocurrency and digital assets. And we need to make sure they're getting good information and they understand what their obligations are. And so I appreciate being able to join you guys today and talk about some of those things. But one of the big things, you mentioned guidance. We also issued the broker regulations. So think 1099s, right? When you trade your stocks, Merrill Lynch or wherever, at the end of the year, you get a 1099 that has all of the information that you need to then go file your tax return. It's very organized, and people just expect that when you're at a stock brokerage. None of that has existed in the digital asset space because those rules were very specific to securities brokers. And so we had to expand those rules, and there was a bill passed back in 2021 called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which basically brought digital assets into that reporting regime. Now, what I've learned and what a lot of people probably don't know is that once a bill is passed, that's the starting line. Because then the agency who is supposed to administer that law, they have to go through and write rules to basically teach people how to comply with those rules. And so there's this whole regulatory process where we have to go and basically interpret what Congress wanted and fit it into the existing rules and regulations. And so it's a long process. It's challenging, especially with a space that is so innovative and moves so quickly. And so we put out these broker regulations for custodial brokers. So think your Coinbases, Geminis, Krakens of the world. And we are now working on non-custodial. So think you're somewhere within the DeFi stack and wallet providers and that kind of thing. And we certainly haven't put out any guidance around like where we believe brokers are yet, but that's the challenge that we're working through right now. And most of these rules really apply to the brokers, but they have clearly an indirect benefit to the taxpayers. Hopefully the end result is that you're getting better information from your broker. So it's easier for you to know what your obligation is to report. And over time, you'll be able to rely on those 1099s much more, just like you do with stocks and equities and commodities.
And in one of those guidelines, and I'll pass it to you after this, but one of those guidelines is around stablecoins. Could you talk a little bit about what the average end user needs to think about and be aware of for new stablecoin guidelines?
Yeah, so again, a lot of these really are broker focused.
Okay.
And so it's around what does a broker need to report? Because what a lot of people don't realize is that when you go to 1099B, which is what you would get from like a stock or brokerage, you usually get as a taxpayer just like a compilation report that lists all of your transactions in one place. But the reality is that those get filed one by one with the IRS. So every time you sell a stock, that's one 1099B that we receive, okay? And so a lot of the comments that we got around stablecoins were because same rule applies to digital assets. These are transaction by transaction reporting. And so a lot of people are like, man, if I'm just buying a cup of coffee at Starbucks, like $5, I'm selling $5 of stablecoin, that could be billions of transactions that the IRS is going to get. And what value is that to us? I mean, I use the analogy of trying to find a needle in a haystack. What that really does is it just makes our haystack a lot bigger without putting more needles in there. And so we received a lot of comments when we put out our proposed rule that basically said, hey, we would love to, could you give us a de minimis or some kind of an aggregation rule? And so what we ended up putting into our final rule was basically if you're buying anything with stablecoin, a qualified stablecoin that's under a cumulative amount of $10,000 per year, the broker doesn't have to do any reporting things. And then if they do have more than $10,000 throughout the year, then they can aggregate that down to one report instead of transaction by transaction. So it's really putting better, it's making it easier for the broker to be able to report that information, but just at an aggregate level. Because again, the question is, what good is all of that information to us? I don't need to know every time you purchase something that's like a tiny amount and with an asset that has next to no gain or loss.
So we mostly are interviewing folks from the government like yourself or institutions, but I do got to ask for like NFTs and like meme coin phenomenon that's been going on. You have to pay like the taxes on the gains, and people don't think about this. And I had multiple friends, I won't name names, but they didn't think to do that. And there's so much, I guess, uncertainty, right? And for retailers that are not watching this, podcast, or people that are not looking up the IRS website, the reality is probably a lot of people are not. What are the new rules around like NFTs, and the volatility with these meme coins and NFTs is so crazy at times? Can you also then deduct your losses just as you can for anything else?
Yeah. So what people, again, I try to analogize to things that people are familiar with. So I go to stocks and equities a lot. The reality is we have defined cryptocurrency and digital assets as property. And what does that mean? Well, it means if you buy something at $100 and you later sell it at $150, you're going to have a capital gain. And depending on how long you held that asset, if it's for 12 months or less, it's a short-term gain, which has higher tax rates. If you held it for a year or longer, that gives you long-term capital gain rates, which is more beneficial. So NFTs are property just like anything else, which means you buy it at one price and it goes up or down, then you'll either have to pay tax on that gain, or you can use that loss to offset other gains that you have. So we always try to peel back some of that mystery, because a lot of people hear NFTs, non-fungible token, cryptocurrencies, and then they glaze over because they're like, I don't get it. I don't even want to try. Especially when we talk to practitioners, like CPAs and folks who have been doing taxes for a long time. I don't want to learn something new. This is complex. Now, there are a lot of people who are focusing in this area, so there's a lot of great practitioners who really get it. But we do try to, remove the mystery from this and analogize as closely as we can to existing assets so they get it. And so some of the challenges, though, NFTs are not exactly like stocks and equities, right? Nice. And one of the biggest differences, and this applies to most digital assets, is that you don't have to cash out to fiat, right? I can take Bitcoin and I can swap that for Ethereum. I can take my Ethereum and swap that for an NFT. And what happens if I go from one NFT and I swap it for another NFT? How do I value that?
Yeah.
It's easy if I'm going to Ethereum because, Ethereum has pricing readily available, so I can get to what that value is. But if I'm going from one NFT to another NFT, how do I know what the value is? And this is something brokers are going to have to try to grapple with. And again, it's not a new concept. People have been valuing art for a long time. And so I sympathize, especially coming from the private sector, having worked with a lot of these brokers. It's a little bit of a hard one to solve, but I'm certain that they'll be able to get there. But if you go from NFT, and oftentimes you can go from one NFT to a basket of NFTs. Like, how do you spread out the value across all of this? So there are unique challenges. And I think it's important that we recognize as a regulating body that we can't just put it into a nice clean box like, it's property. It's property, but there are nuances, and we've got to be able to understand those nuances.
Yeah. What do you, in your role right now, certainly we've been asking questions on the side of the retail user, but when you mentioned before around like comments, when you release guidelines and you're getting comments back from the population itself, how much of that is more the CPAs or the businesses rather than the end consumer?
I love the question because, we received 44,000 comments.
Yeah.
That is like multitudes higher than what you usually would get on comment letters for new regulation. Now, there was use of AI in generating a lot of these comment letters. Now, I'm not saying that like it was bots, but it was like people who were able to sign up and say, this is important to me. But it was almost like doing a form letter. And again, this is not anything new. People have been signing form letters for decades, right? And so for me, knowing we got 44,000 comments, that just shows how interested people are. And it wasn't just practitioners. It wasn't just brokers. It was individuals. It was like, hey, how is this going to impact something that I really believe in? If you write rules that all of a sudden make DeFi permission, that completely changes the game and could ruin something that I really believe in. And so it was really great getting that kind of feedback and seeing the level of interest. I will say, going through all of those comments, because we're also legally obligated to go through all of those comments, I think we were able to kind of boil it down to a dozen topics and things that were kind of consistent across all of those. And so it was not as hard to get through them as I think a lot of people thought. We heard I saw in some socials that where it's like for every 1,000 comment letters or 10,000 comment letters, we're going to push back these rules by a year. I don't think that's how it works. Like, that's okay, whatever. But really, what I want to highlight though is that the comment letters that were the most useful. I have a colleague at Treasury, and I'm stealing this from her because it resonated with me so much. She basically kind of said, here's the gold standard of what a comment letter should do. So number one, tell us who you are and what your business is or what this product is or whatever it is. What is your relationship to this thing? Number two, tell us how these proposed rules impact you and impact your business or impact this thing that you care about. And number three is really where the gold standard comes in. It is, if this doesn't work, what would you recommend? Right? Because what doesn't work is getting a letter saying, you're going to kill crypto. It's like, well, I don't know what to do with that, guys. But for people who really took time to explain the issue, help us understand how it impacted them, and then even gave us alternatives, like that's actually where a lot of the changes that we made in the final rules that we released back in June compared to our proposed rules from August of last year. That's where a lot of those changes came from, were from those comments that were helping educate us. As much as I would love to pretend that I know everything, I do not. And it is so hard to stay on top of all of this. And so this engagement and these comments were very educational, helped us better understand the issues and the technology that we are attempting to regulate.
I have one question. We were talking about like the unrealized gains with the crypto, which is, to clarify, it's over $100 million for the stock market. I didn't ask though, too, is that for whales as well then within crypto, or?
So you're talking about a policy, and we had drinks beforehand. So
Sure.
We were talking about this, but it's a proposal from one of the presidential candidates, right? And so generally they were saying that unrealized gains could be taxed for anybody who has over $100 million. That could be a whale who just really hit it big or came into the industry early. And I was just sitting on, Satoshi.
Yeah.
You haven't cashed out a lot of your crypto, so maybe those are unrealized gains that get taxed. But it is a proposal. It's not law. It's something that one of the candidates is putting out there. For most of us, other than you guys, I don't know if
we're at that stage.
At $100 million quite yet, but
100%.
For most of us, it's not going to have a direct impact on us.
Yeah.
What would you say are some of the misconceptions that you feel like the general population has that come up most often in your conversations? You're coming to an event like this. It's maybe a question like that, but where do you find yourself really educating and winning people over? Like sometimes it's hard to have that first conversation with someone in crypto if you are coming from the government side.
So what's interesting is that, again, talking about 1099 reporting, we got 44,000 comments. And in a lot of ways, I feel like people actually were almost like going against their best interest when they were giving those comments, because we are so used to getting a clean report from our brokerages that tell us exactly what we did throughout the year, that we just either hand over to our CPA or go plug into TurboTax and we're good to go, right? And that's what these rules are designed to do, is to bring that type of reporting to digital assets. And so I do think it's interesting when a lot of people are raising concerns like, oh, look, you're worried about what this broker who makes millions of dollars being a brokerage is going to have to go implement. And it's actually going to be beneficial to you as a taxpayer. And so it is kind of talking through some of those issues, being like, hey, you're kind of trying to hold the water of the broker, but at the end of the day, this is actually going to be beneficial to you. Now, we recognize 1099 reporting isn't going to be perfect. For example, if I go from a centralized exchange and I take my Bitcoin and I transfer it to a self-hosted wallet, and then I engage in some DeFi activity, and then I later transfer that back over to another centralized exchange, tracking that cost basis between all of that is challenging. And those are multiple brokers involved in that sequence of transactions. And so we do recognize that a 1099 is not going to be perfect for everybody. For most people, and we've heard from some of the major brokers out there, that almost 80% of their customers have no transfers in or out of their accounts. And what that means is they basically only transact on that exchange, which means that broker knows everything about what they're doing. So for that taxpayer, again, 80%, that's perfect. That 1099 is going to have everything they need. Now, for you guys, for the cryptophiles, you guys are doing exotic things. And the 20%, that's where a 1099 is not going to cover everything. But it will at least give you better information about, I see I have proceeds reported on this report. I need to go figure out what my cost basis was so I can fill that in on my own tax return, right? So we recognize that, number one, it's going to take time to phase in these rules. But number two, like for people who are doing exotic things, it's never going to cover everybody, but we're trying to make it better for the majority.
Yeah. I mean, it is so complicated. And even if for 99.9% of people that are trying to do things right, it's still very complicated. So big shout out to a lot of the tax platforms that are out there that are coming into the space. Zen Ledger is a good friend of ours and partner of ours that we respect. But in terms of coming to an event like this, like what are you looking to gain out of it at Permissionless? Who are you talking to besides folks like us? And I'm sure you're doing other interviews as well. But what does someone like you look to gain from this? And what do you hope to share with other people that are listening?
Yeah, what I love about these events is it's like, we talk a lot about meeting taxpayers where they're at. And this is where the innovators are.
Jeez.
This is where the people who are just coming up with ideas are. And so what I love is being able to talk to people at the booths and just hearing about what it is that they're creating. Because what I know, having worked in the industry, is like, it's not about the hype of, oh, hey, Bitcoin shot up or this meme coin shot up on the volatility of it. It's really the underlying technology and what is it actually going to go disrupt. And so I love having conversations with people who are like, yeah, we're going to use blockchain technology to enhance supply chain or to be able to change the way that we interact with where a title company used to have to come in and play, like where anywhere there was a middleman. So I love having conversations around, they're not necessarily tax conversations. They're just like, tell me what you're doing. Tell me about the innovations that you're involved in. And then that then helps us understand like where the market is going and where we think that there may be gaps in our rules. And so it helps us then be thinking ahead of time before it becomes too big to address. And so that's what I love doing at these conferences, is learning about what people are doing and also helping people understand that like the IRS has invested deeply in understanding this space. Yeah. And I am one of you. 7 months ago, like I was in those booths, like doing this. And so like you have somebody that is there that gets it and is trying to do the best that we can to accomplish what the IRS needs to help close that tax gap, but also to do it in a way that continues to allow the space to flourish and to be innovative.
Not sure if you're able to answer this one. Are people in the IRS, are they allowed to hold crypto, or are there rules against that?
That is a very good question. And yes, so I think that it kind of depends. I think it's almost dependent on the agency and also dependent on what you're doing. Right? Some agencies take a much more strict approach and say, no, but you can't hold crypto. Others, like you can hold under a certain amount. So it's I don't know like exactly how everybody does, because obviously my experience is working with Treasury and the IRS. But yeah, I mean, we have people who, like when we're in the rulemaking process, we have people who work with us who are like, yeah, I just went and executed this transaction from my MetaMask wallet using Uniswap, and this is what it looked like. Because it's so hard to regulate something that you can't put your hands on. Right. And so in my mind, and again, I'm leading this office, but I'm nothing overly special here. But I think you have to be able to get your hands on what you're trying to regulate to really understand it.
I mean, that's something coming away from this conversation we're encouraged by, because it is Bitcoin transactions settling in 18 minutes at some points, or so much of the trading that happens where people are suddenly in the negative and they're like hearing, oh, hey, maybe someone in your office has also lost money on a meme coin or got too heavy-handed in 2021 when liquidity was high. But those are kind of things where they look out for. Let's make it very clear how people can report losses and report those against their gains, and then maybe have a flat tax year. So what are things that we can look for coming into the next tax year in April coming up, especially on the digital asset side?
Yeah. So again, going back to 1099s, the rules are applicable for custodial brokers right now, and it will start for transactions in 2025 that then would be reported in 2026. So this next upcoming tax season, you likely won't be seeing any 1099s. Now, there's nothing stopping brokers from applying these rules early, but they certainly aren't required to. So you may see some 1099s coming out, but most likely not. So starting in 2025 with reporting year 2026, that's when you start just getting those 1099s. And so that first year will only be proceeds though. So it's not going to be cost basis. And the reason for that is brokers need time to set up their systems. And these systems, that's onboarding, because you've got to do tax, know your customer. Mm-hmm. You've got to collect these forms W-8s and W-9s to certify that the information I gave you is legitimate. And so, Nick, it's touching product teams, it's touching engineers, it's touching tax compliance teams. So we know it's an investment for the broker. And so we wanted to give a phased-in approach, which acknowledged the areas that are the hardest to implement. And so that's why year one would be gross proceeds only. Year two, we'll start tracking cost basis. And so we'll take some time for 1099s to really have all of the information that you need, but we have to start somewhere. And I don't think it would be fair to brokers to all of a sudden be like, yep, right now, today, you've got to start doing this, because having implemented systems like that and built this technology myself on the outside, it's not an easy process. It takes time.
No.
So Seth, thank you so much for coming on the show. Any last words that you'd want to share with the audience? We have typically 30,000, 40,000 listeners that are probably on the edge of their seats thinking about, exactly what's happening in this conversation. I'll probably have to listen to it a few times myself, but I guess any last words you'd want to share with our audience?
Hey, look, we want you guys to hit home runs. We want you guys to do really well. But keep in mind, taxes part of
death and taxes.
Right? And I think for most people, we move so fast that tax is just an afterthought, right? Mm. And so part of our goal with educating people is to, put tax as part of their process, part of their thinking when they're investing. So for example, if I'm going to sell some of my Bitcoin, plan on setting aside X percent for your tax withholding. Just plan it. It's a kind of a cost of doing business, right? So, get ahead of it rather than you get to the end of the year, you now calculate what you owe, and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I really wish I had planned for this ahead of time. So plan ahead, do your best to make sure you know what your liabilities are throughout the year. But otherwise, I love the space. I love the innovation. We want to approach the way we write rules in a way that's going to actually help the space grow. Mm-hmm. And because there's a lot of major players that will not get into this space until there's clarity on regulation, right? Mm-hmm. And not just tax, we're talking from the SEC and CFTC. And so, again, we want, at least from a tax standpoint, which is the world I live in, we want as much clarity as possible for you as taxpayers so that you know what your requirements and obligations are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and welcome to the Blockfield Podcast. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for that.